Hello everyone, my name is Stjepan. I work here in Infinum in Zagreb, and I'm also originally from Zagreb. And I'll be talking to you about view binding and how to handle your views better. So let me begin. As I already mentioned, I work here as an Android engineer. I've been here for a year and a half, and I have had some experience with view binding that I wanted to share with you. So, what is the agenda of this presentation? Well, first I will try to introduce the view binding as a technology and what it does and how it works. Then I will show you a short comparison with the other methodologies for view handling in your views, in your layouts. And I will try to show how view binding is the best choice for today. Then I have some examples from a real project that I made for this purpose. I will try to show you how to use view binding in your activities and fragments. And then I will share some tips and tricks that I have learned in my experience when working with view binding. And the last section is a Q&A section in which I will try to answer some live questions, but since we can't choose all the questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A section on Zoom, and I will type the answers while my other colleague presents. Okay, so let's go. So what is view binding? It was introduced in Android Studio 3.6, and once you enable it, it will generate the binding classes for each of your XML layouts, which means it will generate classes with references to views that you have in your layout. Every view with an ID value will be referenced in the class, but the views that don't have ID, they will be omitted. If you would want to ignore some of the files, you just need to add tools view binding ignore equals true to the root view of your layout. Once you do that, they're generated dynamically as you type your XML, and you can start using them in your activities and fragments. So how to enable or set up the view binding? Well, first you need to add this tiny block to your build Gradle module scope, which means app scope or any other module that might have views, but not the project scope. And then once you enable it, you can just, as I already mentioned, add this tag to ignore some XML files. But that you shouldn't really worry about that, because the generated classes that are not used will be obfuscated by ProGuard. So I don't actually personally use this view binding ignore tag. So how to work with view binding in activities? Well, you just have to instantiate it with the inflate method in onCreate and pass the layout inflator. And this is a really important part. You have to set content view to the binding root view. If you by accident keep your layout ID, it will not work. You will inflate the view twice, and you will be handling the view that is inflated. You will be seeing the view that is inflated in old-fashioned way, but anything you do with the binding instance will not be affected on the screen. Once you do that, you can access your views with binding as I did here. I'm accessing my add button and adding a click listener on that button. Okay, so in fragments, it's a little bit different. And this is important to say because fragments outlive their view life cycle. So you have to handle the binding reference to, you have to destroy it once the view is destroyed, because you might have memory leaks, and your binding reference might still be alive when the views are destroyed. That means you will probably get a null pointer exception. So make sure to destroy the binding reference in onDestroyView in every fragment that you do. And other than that, the instantiation is pretty much the same. You just pass these fragment specific arguments to the inflate method of the binding. And then you pass the binding root as the root view in onCreateView method. Once you do that, you can access your views same way as you did in activity. And there's a second way how you can do this in Fragments, and this only works with Fragments, but I'll just tell you right in the start, I prefer the first way, but this is also something you can do. So once the view is inflated the old-fashioned way, so on create view, you do as you usually would. You can use the bind method to bind the already inflated view to the binding class. So you would actually need to inflate the view first and then pass it to bind method to connect the references. So every view that you have inflated will be connected to the binding variable that is already inside. And then after you do that, you can access your views as you did before. And still you need to destroy the binding reference because it's still alive and has references to your views. Also, why do I prefer the first way? Well, the first way handles the inflation and binding, both of things, and this method only handles binding. So you have to inflate and then bind, but with first method, you only have to do it once.
And here I mentioned them both to talk about why you would use one or another, bind or inflate. As I already mentioned, I prefer to use inflate because there's only one inflation. And you can use bind in some other cases where you can't really control the inflation. Maybe in custom views, actually you can, but maybe in recycler views or something. Okay, so let's go on. I think I covered that one. So what are the features of ViewBinding? It has null and type safety for every view reference that you have inside, but there is one exception. When you have multiple configurations in which one of them has an extra view or something, that view reference will be nullable. So you might want to keep an eye of that and use null safe operators to handle that view in your screens. It works with Kotlin and Java. It generates the nested binding objects for include text. For example, if you include a toolbar in some XML, you would need to give it an ID, and then you can access that toolbar reference also. One of my favorite features is that works automatic in the background. So as you type your XML, it will automatically update. If you add some ID to a view and then go back to the fragment and try to access the view, it will work instantly. So you don't have to rebuild, you don't have to wait or anything. And there is no annotation processing, and it happens in the background, as I mentioned, so it doesn't impact the build time. So what are the limitations? Limitations are that you can't really handle activity or fragment that has multiple different layouts, which is something that you probably shouldn't do anyway, but I just wanted to mention this. So if you use two different XMLs, and I'm not saying configurations, just plainly different XMLs in one activity or fragment, you would need to instantiate two references of binding, which is one more variable to maintain and to destroy reference to, and so on. So I don't recommend that you do that in general, and not with ViewBinding too. Also, it will generate a class for every XML by default, and that might seem like an overhead. But actually ProGuard will obfuscate all those classes that are not used. So that's not really something you should worry about in production. And in debug mode, it's not that much big of a deal. It's just some classes. And also there is one more variable to maintain. That's true. You need to instantiate binding and keep a reference to it in the activity, or in Fragment, you have to destroy the reference. So there's maybe a bit more work, but the benefits are also good. So I don't think that should be a problem. And of course, the possible memory leaks that I already mentioned. So if you don't destroy the reference in time, you could maybe access the views when they are not on the screen, and that shouldn't be possible. Okay, so let's compare the other methods of view handling with view binding. I made a little table to compare this. So in terms of lines of code, view binding, yeah, you have to write additional variable. You have to write some additional expressions to handle your views. So, but it's not that much. I would say it's medium. Kotlin synthetics, it's really easy. You just type the name ID of your view and you can do anything you want. Butterknife and findViewById, you need to have variable for every view that you need to access. So that's a big amount of code. For code generation, Butterknife and ViewBinding are actually almost the same. They have a same idea in behind, but ViewBinding replaced by Butterknife. And Kotlin synthetics, they also generate some code in behind, but it's really not much. It's few lines of code. And findViewById doesn't generate anything. So ViewBinding is null safe. As I mentioned, it has cases when there are multiple configurations, so views are nullable, but that's logical. Kotlin synthetics, well, they are kind of null safe, but you can also access views from other layouts without knowing it. You have to keep an eye on the imports. If they have same IDs, you might actually access the wrong one and have a null pointer exception. So yeah, it's not that safe. It has also some other edge cases that are not really that safe. Same goes with Butterknife, even though it has an optional annotation to annotate the views that might not be there, so they're automatically considered nullable. findViewById doesn't have any mechanism to cover this. In terms of type safety, well, actually all of them, but findViewById are kind of type safe. If you ignore the nullability, they're type safe, definitely. And all of them work with both Java and Kotlin, except for Kotlin synthetics. So that's a plus for view binding. Also important to mention, Butterknife was deprecated in favor of view binding. They have the similar ideas, so it just felt right to do this at this time as view binding came out and became officially supported and maintained by Google. Same with Kotlin synthetics, they will be removed in the near future. I believe it's not exactly, we don't have the dates exactly yet, but they'll definitely be removed. And Google already mentions that they recommend using view binding instead. findViewById, it works, but it's really old. I don't think any of you who wrote any Android code in the last year has been using findViewById. You can still do it, but I highly recommend view binding instead. Okay, so what can we do better when using the view binding? Well, there are a couple of tricks, delegates and extensions circling around the web, how you can make your view binding instantiation shorter. So I hope you all have heard about extensions in Kotlin and delegates, because that's what we're going to use to make our view binding code simpler here. I'm just going to show you some real project code. So for an activity, we have this extension that actually takes a function that can inflate, so has an inflator parameter, and it returns the ViewBinding type for that activity, and does it in a lazy manner. So only when the variable is accessed, then first time, then it will be initialized, and from then on, it will stay the same. So this is on the, you can see a real example in the main activity here of using this extension. So I'm actually instantiating my binding by ViewBinding extension, and I'm passing the reference to activity main binding because that's the name of the generated binding class. And this method reference inflate is actually a method that takes a layout inflator and returns an instance of the binding. So that's why I'm using it here as a parameter. And after doing that, I can use my binding normally, as you can see in onCreate, and there's no problems with lifecycle whatsoever because activity lives as long as their view. So there's no possibility of memory leaks. As for fragments, it's a bit more complicated. This is the whole code. I will explain piece by piece, so don't worry if you can't really see everything here. So let's get to the first part. This is a Kotlin feature, read-only property. Actually, it works in Java too, but it's a bit more complicated. So you can use this to delegate some instantiation of variables to this class that is read-only property. And in this one, I'm actually using fragment as the host, and output should be a ViewBinding. So ViewBinding is a generic type because each fragment has its own ViewBinding. And this is the first part. This is just class definition and binding variable that is initially null. The second part is get value, which runs when I try to access the binding. And then it checks for the life cycle, because the life cycle of a fragment needs to be at least initialized so we can ensure that the view is alive, view is already inflated. Because if you try to access binding, actually instantiate binding before the view is inflated, it won't work. So after I'm sure that the fragment state, lifecycle state is initialized, I'm initializing the binding and I'm returning it. So actually that's how delegates work. It just takes care of some background logic that you would normally have to do and returns the type that you defined it with. Okay, and the third part, and the really important part of this delegate, is the lifecycle observing. So this is init method of the delegate, and it runs as soon as it's created. So, and this method actually subscribes to the lifecycle of fragment first, and then when it's created, then it subscribes again to the lifecycle of the view owner. So that's kind of a view lifecycle inside a fragment. So fragment lives longer than his views, but a view has a shorter lifecycle, and we are subscribing to the view lifecycle. That's the UI part on the screen. And once the view is destroyed, we are just destroying the reference to binding to avoid any memory leaks. So it might seem like a lot of code here when I show it, but after you once do this, you can actually use binding as easy as in activities here. So you can just use this one line, view binding, and everything else is taken care of. You don't have to worry about destroying references. And yeah, one more thing that I forgot to show here that I skipped is view binding extension for fragment, as we had in activity, but it only used the fragment view binding property or delegate in the extension to actually instantiate the binding class. Okay, so once you do this, you actually have almost the same code in activities and fragments, and you don't have to worry about anything else. So I hope this helps. You can use binding as you would normally use it. And if I'm right, that's all from me. I will now answer a couple of questions. I hope you enjoy this presentation.